I always have mixed feelings when people complain that news is depressing because when it's a good story and when it's a well told story and it's told respectfully, that's usually some of the most important reporting. I think that's what Mike Magner's done here. Certainly, a trust betrayed will make you shake your head, and the stats will make you close your eyes and sigh. But this is, the story of deplorable negligence and even worse obfuscation is necessary to be told. I'm sure many of you know the basics of the story, Camp Lejeune's contaminated water supply, but in the book, Mike goes further, he discusses someone who was asked to store and mix pesticides in a building that was later used as a daycare center. Talks about a civilian worker who was asked to simply bury 50 drums of mustard gas and nerve gas. And then he goes on to tell the stories of a few determined veterans who eventually stepped up to demand change. So I'm thrilled Mike is here today to discuss these details, and please help me in welcoming Mike Magner.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate all of you being here on a beautiful Saturday in Washington. I'm sort of overwhelmed that this many people would come inside, and if I ever figure out the Twitter thing, I may have to tweet about all of this. The timing of this event is a little bit uncanny, actually. It was scheduled months ago before the Department of Veterans Affairs melted down in a crisis over such long delays in care that veterans are dying while on months-long waiting lists to see a doctor at a VA medical center. And it was set up well before a devastating ruling came down last week from the Supreme Court that would make it very difficult for victims of Camp Lejeune's poisoned water to seek compensation and justice from the federal government. So the moment for a discussion of a trust betrayed couldn't be better, with so much attention focused on the problems of veterans today. The scandal at the VA and the debacle at Camp Lejeune are both shameful illustrations of dysfunction and mismanagement in what I think most Americans would agree should be one of the highest priorities of our government, taking care of those who have served the country and who in many cases have sacrificed a great deal on our behalf. But there is also a significant difference in these two situations involving treatment of our veterans. In the case of the VA, the government fully acknowledges it has not done right by our veterans. General Shinseki himself said when he resigned as VA secretary a couple of weeks ago that the department needed new leadership and a major overhaul of how it provides services. And both the administration and Congress appear to be moving aggressively to address the problems. Both the House and Senate have passed bills to expand medical services for veterans, giving them coverage at private healthcare systems if they can't get into a VA facility. Differences between the two chambers' bills still need to be reconciled, but passage is virtually assured. But in the case of Camp Lejeune, the government's response has been just the opposite. The Navy and the Marine Corps adamantly deny that they were negligent in fulfilling one of their most basic responsibilities, providing safe drinking water to hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children on one of the biggest military installations in the country. The top brass argue they did nothing wrong because none of the contaminants that were present in Camp Lejeune's water for several decades were not regulated at the time, though that is a blatant lie, as I'll explain in a few minutes. Pentagon officials, along with some in the White House and the Justice Department, have also gone out of their way to obstruct efforts by federal scientists to investigate the links between the tainted water and health problems among as many as 1 million people who lived at the base between the mid-1950s and the mid-1980s when the water was contaminated. They have withheld money for studies, refused to release data on the base's water system, and even attempted to manipulate research by the National Academy of Sciences and the Environmental Protection Agency in a failed attempt to show that the chemicals in the water did little or no harm. Most egregious of all, the government just in recent months has taken an almost absurd legal stance, siding with toxic polluters in the federal courts to block damage claims by Camp Lejeune victims. They're exploiting a loophole in the federal Superfund law. They have set up a proverbial catch-22 that was validated by the Supreme Court on Monday, as I'll also explain shortly. Before I go any further, I should explain that I am not a veteran. So this is not a book written from the perspective of one who has been affected by the mistreatment of veterans. The closest I came to military service was in 1971, the year after I turned 18, and I was included in the second draft for military service that was done by lottery. There had been a lot of controversy about the draft during the Vietnam War in the 1960s, when people with money and connections could more easily obtain deferments or safe assignments, such as when George W. Bush was allowed to remain stateside in the Texas Air National Guard rather than be called into service at the height of the war in Vietnam in 1968. And so a disproportionate burden for fighting the war was falling on low-income families and minorities. So in 1969, the selective service system was changed to a draft lottery in which all the days of the year were pulled from a drum at random to determine the order of who would be called up based on their birthdays. Those who were born on the first third of the dates that were called were almost certain to be drafted. The middle group was about 50-50, and the last third were free of mandatory service. My draft number was 304, so I was able to continue with college at Georgetown and at Georgetown University here. And being in Washington in the early 1970s, when the anti-war movement was raging in the streets and the Washington Post's Woodward and Bernstein were exposing corruption in the Nixon administration after the Watergate break-in, I became addicted to following politics and policy and decided to pursue a career in journalism. I got my first job as a copy boy in the Washington Bureau for the Newhouse newspapers, which led me to my first real job as a reporter at the Kalamazoo Gazette in Michigan, and then back to Washington as a correspondent for the Gazette and 7 other Newhouse papers in Michigan. Then in 2002, I joined a small news service that did investigative reporting on environmental issues, and it was there that I came across the story of Camp Lejeune about 10 years ago. We were investigating public health threats posed by contaminated military sites, of which there are hundreds around the country, including 140 that are on the Superfund list of the worst hazardous waste sites in America. When we came to Camp Lejeune, we were led to several people who had been stationed there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and whose families had suffered terrible health tragedies. The first was Tom Townsend, who is the subject of the opening chapter in A Trust Betrayed. Tom Townsend was a career Marine officer who actually experienced the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor when he was 10 years old. His father was a Navy officer on a ship based at Pearl, and Tom still vividly recalls waking up on the morning of December 7th, 1941, to go out and get the Sunday paper so he could read the funnies, and he saw a Japanese Zero fly past him about 50 yards away with its machine guns blazing as it headed toward the U.S. ships in the harbor. The experience motivated Townsend to join the Marines right out of high school. And in the mid-1960s, he and his wife and two children were transferred to Camp Lejeune. While they lived there, Tom's wife Ann became pregnant with their third child, a boy named Christopher, who was born in March 1967. 6 weeks later, he died at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he was being treated after doctors at Camp Lejeune discovered he had a heart defect and a host of other ailments. The Townsends were absolutely devastated, and Ann blamed herself for almost 3 decades before they learned that contaminated drinking water at Camp Lejeune in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s may have been responsible for health problems among babies born there during those years. Then there was Jerry Ensminger, another career Marine who was a drill instructor assigned to Camp Lejeune, when his wife, a Japanese woman he had met in Okinawa when he was assigned to the Marine base there, became pregnant in 1975. Etsuko Ensminger was only at the base during her first trimester, but during that 3 months she was drinking water tainted with toxic chemicals that were going directly into the developing fetus in her womb. After her birth in 1976, Janie Ensminger seemed like a perfectly normal child, until she fell ill a few weeks shy of her 7th birthday. A short time later, Janie was diagnosed with leukemia, and so began a painful, agonizing series of treatments at a number of different hospitals over a period of more than 2 years. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read just a couple of pages that tell you the story about the last days of Janie's life. Jerry Ensminger's daughter Janie turned 9 years old on July 30th, 1985, exactly 2 months after Major General Buell sent his notice about the wells being shut down. Janie's leukemia had gone into remission for more than a year after it was discovered in 1983, But her father received some crippling news when he asked the Marine Corps in 1985 for a transfer to a reserve unit in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, so that Janie could undergo treatment at the Penn State University Medical Center closer to his family. One of the doctors who evaluated Ensminger's request wrote a letter saying that Janie's white blood count was over 150,000, which put her in a high-risk category and limited the ability or the chances that she would have long-term survival. Ensminger said, "I lived that nightmare every day from that time I saw that letter. Every day that entered my mind." Ensminger later transferred his daughter to the Duke Children's Hospital and Health Center in Durham, North Carolina, which specializes in pediatric cancer treatment. During a visit in September 1985, one of the doctors said that Janie had relapsed, and that was the beginning of the end, Ensminger said. Janie was a lot like me, Ensminger told a writer for the Daily Beast, Lloyd Grove, for a story in 2011. She's very forward. She asserts herself, very alert, very aware of her surroundings. She wanted to know everything, and she wanted her voice in everything. The doctors suggested another round of chemotherapy for Janie, but they warned that it would be painful with lots of sores and ulcers. "I said, no, I don't want that," Ensminger told Grove. Janie was laying over there in the bed, and she said, "Hey, you're talking about me, and I want to say in this. If there's a chance I can live, I want to do it. I told the doctors, you heard her. They did it, and oh my God, I still have her purse and all the stuff she had in her room. She had little examining lights, those flashlights that doctors use, and a little compact in her purse with a mirror. And she was obsessed with those sores, and she would constantly shine that thing in her mouth." Grove told Ensminger that he thought it was incredible that his daughter could face such a terrifying illness and the excruciating treatments with such courage and practicality. "With any kid that has cancer and who's been in treatment for a long time," Ensminger responded, "if you weren't sitting there looking at that child and knowing that they were a child, you would think you were talking to an adult. They're all that way." Janie's final days were horrific, Ensminger said in testimony before Congress in 2007. "Every time she got stuck with a needle, I was there holding her," he said. "She was screaming in my ear. Every time they stuck a needle through her bone to her hip to pull out bone marrow, I held her and she screamed in my ear, 'Daddy, Daddy, don't let them hurt me.' And the only thing that I could say to her was, 'Honey, the only reason they're hurting you is they're trying to help you.'" In a later interview, Ensminger said he marveled at his daughter's strength in the face of death. "Janie told me she didn't want to die," he said. "She wanted to live so she could make a difference in this world. She even had a sense that her presence would be felt after she was gone. A few days before she died, Janie told her father, 'Every time you see a rainbow, Daddy, it'll be me.'" Janie died on September 24th, 1985. "And then on the day of her death, I started crying," Ensminger told members of Congress. "I hadn't cried in front of Janie before that time because she was pulling her strength from me. And I had to be strong for her. If I had to cry, I went somewhere else. But that day I started crying, and she looked up at me, and she had pneumonia that bad she could hardly talk, and she said, 'Stop it.' And I said, 'Stop what?' She said, 'Stop crying, Daddy, I love you.' And that was the last words my daughter said to me. She went into a coma. 35 minutes later, she took her last breath." I kind of get choked up every time I read that, even though I wrote it. So what happened at Camp Lejeune? Well, the story goes all the way back to the opening of the base in 1941, when the Marine Corps was preparing for the inevitable start of World War II and needed a place to train Marines for the beach landings that were anticipated to be a key part of the strategy against the Japanese in the Pacific. One base was built on the west coast at Camp Pendleton in California, and a scout plane was sent all up and down the Atlantic and Gulf coasts to find a site to train recruits from the eastern United States. They settled on a 9-mile stretch of beach in North Carolina that had undeveloped forests and swamplands inland for battlefield training, and Camp Lejeune was born. After the war, the base grew to become the headquarters for the Marine Division in the eastern half of the United States, and essentially became a mid-sized city with capacity to have as many as 180,000 people on board at any one time. As the base grew, The volume of waste generated by the military operations grew as well. And the Marine Corps did what just about every other installation and most industries in the U.S. did in the 1950s and 60s and 70s until stricter environmental laws were passed, and that is they dumped everything on the land. At Camp Lejeune, they poured used oil on the roads to reduce dust from all the vehicles that were moving around. They dumped used battery acid into pits. They buried chemical weapons and pesticides and other hazardous materials in landfills. There were fuel leaks from a massive depot where diesel and gasoline were stored in underground tanks. There was a dry cleaner directly across the street from one of the most populated housing areas on the base, Tarawa Terrace, that was spilling a cleaning solvent called perchloroethylene, or PERC, on the ground on an almost daily basis. And one of the most damaging practices at the base, though not many people realized it at the time, was the use of a highly toxic solvent called TCE, or trichloroethylene, which is a potent degreaser, almost like lighter fluid. They used it to hose down jeeps and tanks and planes and weapons to remove grit and grime after their use. And the workers at the motor pools and the maintenance areas did what everyone did. They let the chemicals run off onto the ground or into the storm drains. Now, this practice at other locations was not too terrible if there was no groundwater beneath the surface, or if the soils were impermeable, or if the drinking water in the area was being piped in from a clean source. But at Camp Lejeune, located right on the coast, all the soils are sandy, and everything that is dumped on the land filters right down into the water table. And at Camp Lejeune, they were using the shallowest aquifer, about 150 feet below the surface, for their water supply. So over the years, the chemicals in the water kept building up, but no one really realized it. The water didn't smell that bad, and if it tasted a little funny, well, most Marine families who moved around a lot were used to that. But there were warning signs that things weren't quite right. In the 1960s, there were dozens of miscarriages and stillbirths and other incidents of early childhood deaths among women who became pregnant at Camp Lejeune, many of them living on the base while their husbands were doing tours of duty in Vietnam. There were so many babies dying that a section of the cemetery near Camp Lejeune became filled with gravestones for very young children, a section that locals came to call Baby Heaven. But again, because there were hundreds of births at Camp Lejeune every year, no one really understood that there were more problems than usual at the base. And then finally in 1980 came a real warning shot across the Navy's bow. An Army lab that was testing military installations for contaminants that were just then being regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act discovered that test results were skewed by the presence of solvents in the water samples. The lab technician sent several notices of the problem to the environmental managers at Camp Lejeune, but the warnings were largely ignored, partly because there was so much demand for water in the hot North Carolina climate where Marines were training on a daily basis that they were pumping the aquifer to the max, and they didn't really want to think about how they would get by if some of the more than 100 wells at the base had to be shut down. Besides, the commanders thought, our Marines can take anything. What's a little solvent in the water going to do to them? And then in 1984, a fuel leak directly into one of the base water systems forced the Marine Corps to flush out the system and then conduct tests to see if the water was clean. Those tests revealed levels of TCE in the water hundreds of times beyond the suggested safe limit, including one reading at a base elementary school that was 1,400 parts per billion. EPA advisories at the time suggested there should be no more than 5 parts per billion of TCE in drinking water. And so the Marines were forced to shut down 10 wells at the base in early 1985, but they insisted it was not because any environmental standards were being violated. The EPA, they correctly noted, did not yet have regulations for TCE and other solvents in drinking water. Those would not be established until the late 1980s. But what the Marines failed to say was that under the Navy's own regulations, put into effect in 1963, there was a requirement that no toxic substance of any kind should be in the water supply at a Navy or Marine Corps base. This was a regulation of its own that was being violated, but no one ever mentioned it among the Navy command. Now, the shutdown of the wells immediately attracted the attention of the state of North Carolina and the EPA, and it didn't take much investigation for environmental officials to realize that Camp Lejeune was a toxic mess. Nearly the entire base was designated a federal Superfund site in 1989, and under the Superfund law, that meant that federal scientists were required to study whether hazardous waste at the site constituted a public health threat. The government agency assigned to do the study, of a division of the Centers for Disease Control called the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR, began an investigation at Camp Lejeune in the early 1990s, and in 1997 they put out their first report. The agency found that after examining birth records at the Camp Lejeune Hospital from 1968 to 1985, that there were a higher than normal percentage of babies with low birth weights, which is a sign of other potential health problems. Scientists at the ATSDR wanted to look further and contact as many families as they could who had babies at the base to see what problems they had experienced. Initially, the Marine Corps refused to provide information, though, about the Marine families who had lived at Camp Lejeune, saying it would violate their privacy. But when the scientists decided to do the study without the data, the Marine Corps Command, realizing that how that would make them look, backed down and provided data such as Social Security records and addresses to help locate those families. In 2002, after contacting more than 12,000 families who had babies at Camp Lejeune between 1968 and 1985, the ATSDR issued a report saying that more than 100 of those babies, nearly 1%, had either birth defects or childhood cancer. And the outrage over the fact that the Marine Corps may have caused health problems among hundreds, if not thousands of people who had served their country honorably, began to build. Jerry Ensminger, Tom Townsend, and others who believed the Marine Corps had poisoned their children began a crusade to demand a full accounting of what happened and to get compensation if that was warranted. The Washington Post did a story about the victims in 2004, a story that caught the eye of Representative John Dingell on Capitol Hill, just at the time the Pentagon was asking for exemptions from environmental laws in the wake of 9/11. Dingell invited Ensminger to testify at a hearing on the exemptions request, and his story about his daughter's death convinced enough members that the military should not be allowed to ignore environmental laws, given what they had done at Camp Lejeune. Over the next few years, there were more hearings, and Congress ordered the National Academy of Sciences to study whether the contaminated water at Camp Lejeune had caused health problems. But when the study was completed in 2009, victims of the tainted water were stunned. The scientists concluded that while more than a dozen serious illnesses such as liver cancer and nervous system disorders can be linked to the toxic chemicals found at Camp Lejeune, it could not definitively state that all the illnesses among Lejeune veterans and their families could be linked to the drinking water at the base. Many independent scientists were appalled and publicly criticized the study, and Jerry Ensminger dug up evidence that members of the scientific panel had been wined and dined at Camp Lejeune before they began their work, suggesting there was an attempt to influence the study results. But the damage was done by the NAS report, and the news media began to show less interest in reporting about the problems of Camp Lejeune victims. But then came perhaps the most stunning turn of events in this long saga of Camp Lejeune. In 2007, a Florida man named Mike Partain, who had been born at Camp Lejeune in 1968 when his father was stationed there, was diagnosed with breast cancer. Now, male breast cancer is exceedingly rare in this country. Less than 1% of breast cancer cases are men. And Mike Partain was devastated about what had happened to him. There was no history of breast cancer in his family, even among the women, and he could not understand why the potentially fatal disease had struck him. Then, as he was undergoing chemotherapy after a mastectomy, Partain's father told him to turn on CNN, which was airing a report about Jerry Ensminger testifying before Congress about his daughter. The report said that the government was investigating whether babies born at Camp Lejeune after 1968, the year Mike Partain was born, had been harmed by toxic drinking water. Mike knew immediately what caused his illness. He dug out a photo of his mother holding him as a newborn at Camp Lejeune, and there was a glass of tap water on the table beside the bed. Partain linked up with Ensminger and also went to his local paper in Florida to tell them what had happened. The story went out over the internet, and within a short time, Partain began hearing from other former Marines or sons of Marines who had been diagnosed with breast cancer, years after living at Camp Lejeune. Over the next few years, Partain had tracked down more than 80 cases of male breast cancer among former Lejeune residents, a number that was just way off the charts. The media again began to show an interest in Camp Lejeune's story, and Congress acted on the issue in 2012, passing a law called the Janie Act that provides health coverage from the VA for any Marines and family members who had any of 15 different illnesses after having lived at Camp Lejeune when the water was contaminated. The law is now slowly being implemented, though since it is the first time the VA has been required to provide health care for anyone other than veterans, in this case family members of veterans, no one has actually received coverage yet because the VA is struggling with how to do that while also dealing with their many other problems right now. At this point, several thousand Marines and family members have filed claims against the government for damages done by the toxic water at Camp Lejeune, but the processing of all those claims has been put on hold until the ATSDR completes several more studies, including how many cases of male breast cancer can be linked to the contaminated water. Some victims have also gone to federal court to demand damages from the government, and more than a dozen of those cases have been consolidated in federal court in Georgia. But that's where the most recent insult to Camp Lejeune veterans developed. Separately from Camp Lejeune, there was another case of toxic contamination in North Carolina in the 1970s and 80s, where a manufacturing plant in Asheville dumped TCE on the land that made its way into groundwater in the area. In 2011, more than a dozen property owners near the former plant discovered that their wells had been contaminated with TCE and filed suit against the company, CTS Corporation, seeking damages under the federal Superfund law. The company argued in federal court that under a North Carolina law called the Statute of Repose, a company cannot be sued for environmental pollution more than 10 years after the last act of contamination. And in this case, the plant had been closed in 1985. The district court agreed, and the property owners went to the appeals court, arguing that under the federal Superfund law, victims of contamination have the right to sue for damages for 2 years after they discover the pollution, not after the acts were committed. And in this case, they found out in 2011 that their wells had been contaminated. It really took that long for the pollution to move through the groundwater to their homes. So they argued that the federal law should take precedence over the state law and give them the right to demand compensation from the company. The appellate court actually agreed with them, and so the case went to the Supreme Court. And this is where the twist comes in. Before the arguments were heard this past April, the Justice Department filed a brief siding with CTS Corporation in the case because the government realized that if the North Carolina Statute of Repose prevents lawsuits against CTS, it could also block claims by victims of Camp Lejeune, where the last act of contamination occurred in 1985. Victims like Jerry Ensminger and Mike Partain were so angry, they did not learn that they had been affected by Camp Lejeune's water for long after 10 years after the last act of pollution was committed in 1985. Mike Partain didn't know for 39 years that he was affected by the drinking water. And so they were outraged that the government was trying to put this roadblock in front of them. They came to Washington and protested outside the court before the arguments were heard, and they even were joined by Erin Brockovich, the woman who fought PCE, or the electric company out in California, and was made a movie about. She was outraged. She came all the way across the country from California to argue about how outrageous it was for the government to take this kind of stance. But last Monday, the court ruled 7-2 that Congress did in fact not include statutes of repose when it wrote the Superfund law, and so therefore the federal law does not supersede the state law in North Carolina. So unless either Congress addresses the Superfund law and says that it does preempt statutes of repose, or if the North Carolina legislature changes its law, Camp Lejeune victims could see their claims against the government dismissed in federal court. And if that happens, it will be a very, very sad final chapter in the case of a trust betrayed. So at that point, I think if anybody has any questions or would like to make any comments, be happy to hear.
I used to work at EPA in the 80s, actually, in water enforcement for about 3 or 4 years. But before this broke, most of the environmental cases involving the military were against military contractors, like the what's it called, Rocky in Colorado.
Rocky Flats, I think.
Rocky Flats. The Shell was running, I think. And there have been several in other places. This apparently was directly the Marines. There was no defense contractor.
Right.
Why do you think they fought it so hard?
Largely because they know if they're proven to be negligent,
Right.
and thousands of people can prove that they were harmed by this pollution, it could cost the government billions of dollars in compensation. I mean, just one death, like Janie Ensminger, Jerry Ensminger could insist on the value of her life. How do you put a number on that? But the government
The courts do
knows-
that all the time, actually.
Well, yeah,
so-
we do. But the government knows that in this case, that exposure is billions of dollars. At a time when the Pentagon budget's being cut, there's not money for it. But, it becomes a question of, do you compensate these people who were harmed? Or do you save the Pentagon some money and the government some money?
Did they finally clean it up?
Well, as you know from working at the EPA, these cleanups of groundwater take years and years. They are pumping out groundwater and having it, the
Recycle.
contaminants evaporate and so on. It's not completely cleaned up, but they have shut down all wells that are contaminated, and they're not using them for drinking water.
And they're piping water in from someplace
No,
else?
they have enough. There are places on the base that were not contaminated, and the groundwater is fine. As long as they manage it carefully and test the water. They say the water is tested now there more than any other water supply in the world, so it's considered to be safe. But there's another issue actually that's starting to develop, and that is TCE and these other chemicals like benzene kind of evaporate up
Right.
through the ground, and there could be an air problem in some of the buildings at the base. And it's an issue that's starting to emerge because there was a case where a woman who worked in a building at Camp Lejeune died of cancer not too long ago. And her husband is concerned that maybe she was exposed to the air contaminants from the poisons under the water, under the ground.
When I was at EPA, before I worked in water enforcement, I was in the General Counsel's office for the Toxic Substances Control Act, and benzene came up. It was one of the first old chemicals. And at that point, this was the Reagan administration, they were trying to switch it from EPA regulating it to OSHA, where in fact the exposures are much higher, but the law is much weaker.
Yeah.
So all you have to do is sort of disclose, and then they fight about respiratory equipment. Whereas in the environmental statutes, like the Clean Air Act, or even the Toxic Substances Control Act, if you can get through all the procedure, the power of the government to shut things down is much, much greater.
Yeah. I don't want to pick on George Bush administration, but this past administration was just as bad as the Reagan administration in that sense. And I mentioned they were requesting exemptions from all the environmental laws right after 9/11 because they were facing some other kinds of lawsuits from environmental groups, for example, in the Pacific, who were concerned that submarine operations and that kind of thing were affecting some of the whales and other sea life. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, was behind all of this, said we shouldn't be spending our money on environmental laws. We need to be focused on the terrorism attack. And he thought he could get away with it because in that atmosphere after 9/11, everybody agreed we need to be focused first and foremost on terrorism. But after Jerry Ensminger told his story, that there was a vote on the committee that he appeared before about whether to grant exemptions, and even all of the Republicans on the committee said, no, we can't give them that much leeway because of what happened at Camp Lejeune. So in that sense, Jerry is considered a real hero by his fellow Marines. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sadly. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Or
Has anyone from the government ever apologized to these folks?
no,
Or
not
or
really.
admitted fault, I guess, or anything like that? Is that
Partly because if they apologize, they feel that would be acknowledging they were negligent, and that apology would be used in the courts in these cases that are coming up. The lawyers are basically in control. I mean, I had a standing request while I was writing this book to interview the Commandant of the Marine Corps. I said I'd go anywhere at any time if you're willing to sit down and talk about your feelings about it. And they sent me an email saying, I'm sorry, he's really busy, you know. So he did not respond. And they have never publicly apologized. Some of the Marine officers at hearings have gone so far as to say, I wish we could have done things differently. They always stop short of admitting that they were wrong, you know. So it's just the way, because the lawyers are in control at this point.
What about the state? Has it tried? Has it stepped into the breach here and tried to help?
Well, when the Superfund site designation was done in 1987, in 1989, basically there was an agreement that the EPA would be in charge of the cleanup. So the state doesn't have a role once they kind of cede their authority over to the EPA on a site. But the state has always been concerned because they're responsible for protecting the groundwater resources, and they do monitor. I mean, there's a pretty big city right near Camp Lejeune, Jacksonville, that gets its water from an aquifer that also flows beneath Camp Lejeune. But fortunately for the city, they take their water from a much deeper aquifer that hasn't been affected. But they were very worried that, you know, some of these contaminants might ultimately end up there. So the state's monitoring, but they don't have, they kind of gave away their legal authority to the EPA in this case.
Yeah, could you say something more about some of the people you interviewed and how you tracked them down and got their cooperation?
Yeah, actually it was pretty easy to track them down because after the first studies came out that indicated that children were affected by the pollution, some of these people like Jerry Ensminger, and there were some others who began social media. This is even before Facebook was created, back in 1999 and 2000, 2001. And they started forming their own network through emails, and a couple of them set up websites. One of them was set up by Jerry. It's called The Few, the Proud, the Forgotten, TFTPTF.com. And they allow people to post their stories there. So it was pretty easy to find them. Jerry keeps Jerry Ensminger keeps a great database of everybody who's been affected. So through that, I was able to contact a lot of people. And some of the stories are just so tragic. One of them who's in the book is a guy named Mike Gross. He was actually a OBGYN at Camp Lejeune when all this was happening in the early 1980s. And I asked him too, you know, did you notice more problems among the babies born there? And he said there were so many kids being born in that population that, you know, it's all a lot of young women and families, that they didn't really notice. And in the early 80s, I guess it was just common to have some miscarriages and so on, just as it is today. Mike actually served his 3 years his first 3 years in service at Camp Lejeune as a doctor, and then went back to his home state of Texas to set up his own practice. And about, I think it was about 20 years later, he was diagnosed with a rare form of Hodgkin's disease, a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he had no idea what could have caused that, but he realized he was a doctor at the base, scrubbing his hands on numerous times every day. So not only was he getting it on his skin, but the vapors were coming up. And it's probably the worst way to get toxic chemicals into your system is by breathing them in constantly. And he believes that it caused his cancer. He had to have bone marrow transplant that his son donated, the bone marrow. He had to give up his practice. He's barely surviving now. He's been in the hospital numerous times with complications, but he still lives. He testified before Congress in 2007 about what happened, and he's an angry man, actually, and would like to see some kind of compensation for what happened.
But what about the people that actually made the pollution, that spilled this stuff? How did you get a hold of them and get them to talk?
Well, most of them wouldn't talk. And so what I was able to do, though, thanks to Jerry Ensminger and Tom Townsend, who filed scores of Freedom of Information Act requests, and I did some of my own, we obtained all kinds of documents, memorandums that were written when the pollution was discovered, and we quote a lot of those in the book, because the people that were there at the time, many of them aren't there anymore or are long, passed away maybe. So we basically relied on what they were saying at the time when they tried to address it, and there were a lot of excuses made. They dismissed when they were warned that there were solvents in the water. They came up with an excuse that maybe the tests weren't done properly, maybe the solvents were in the jars that they used to collect samples, and they found every way they could to avoid acknowledging what was happening.
Well, of course, we have our own story locally here. Is over in Spring Valley, and they were burying chemical munitions at the end of World War I.
Oh, I think I've heard
over
about
in
that.
Spring Valley, it used to be in World War I, it was undeveloped land, and they were using it as a test site for chemical weapons. And they just buried this stuff, and it's been an ongoing story for 20 years in Uptown Citizen about how the military has denied
Yep.
that there's anything there, and stonewalled actions all along. And
Right. Well, sad to say, that's just one of hundreds of places like that. There's a former Air Force base down in San Antonio. It was the largest Air Force base in the country at the time, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's now an industrial park. But they were using TCE, barrels of TCE, to hose down every plane after it landed. And it all just went down into the groundwater. And there are neighborhoods around San Antonio, mostly Hispanic neighborhoods, unfortunately, that they have crosses put up in their yards, one color of a cross for someone who died of cancer, and another color of a cross for someone who has cancer or is fighting cancer. And it's almost every house in this neighborhood. And again, the government is denying that it's clearly the TCE from the base went down into the groundwater. The government says, well, these people aren't drinking that water because they have it piped in from the city system. But yet, those chemicals are coming up into their homes through the wells, the old wells that were there. And some of the people may still be using the wells. So it's clearly connected. But it's again, they don't want to face the potential liabilities. I think if the case in Camp Lejeune is settled on behalf of the victims, it's going to set a precedent for a lot of other sites. And that's another reason why the government is so worried about this case. If it opens the door to them getting compensation, you could have hundreds and hundreds of more cases from places like what you just mentioned, So it's a real dilemma. I think it was Kelly Air Force Base in where is Laughlin? I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if they have problems there. Yeah. There's a former Marine base out in California in Orange County. It was called the El Toro Marine Air Base, and they sold it for very high-end property in Orange County, which is major area of residential development outside Los Angeles. And they discovered when they were building the sites that the ground there was saturated with TCE. And so they required every house, some of these multi-million-dollar houses, has to have a system that prevents vapors from the ground from getting into the house. In order to not be breathing this stuff, you would want that, because the Marine Corps never went in and cleaned all that soil out. It would have been almost impossible, I think, But they were doing exactly what they were doing at all these other bases. hosing down the plains with TCE and letting it run off onto the ground. I think on a very limited basis because it is so hazardous. The EPA has just completed a study that the effects are so widespread. I mean, it's not just cancer, it's nervous system disorders, all kinds of problems. And they are actually in the process of right now of lowering the acceptable limit. It's 5 parts per billion, and they think it should be no more than 1 parts per billion. So it's that dangerous. And I guess the ironic thing is that back in the 50s, after the war, it was considered like a miracle kind of chemical. It would do so much. And the companies that made it never really advised people about disposal because they always thought, you dump it on the ground, it'll just evaporate. Exactly. Oh my God. Well, I guess they used to use mercury in the thermometers, and kids would play with it. And then they discovered how harmful it was to the brain, to the nervous system. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the Supreme Court decision. You said it was a 7-2 decision.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court decisions get publicized pretty well, and
Yeah.
articles are written. I am unaware of any article being written
About the decision, USA Today did one on Tuesday. If you look online, you could find it by a reporter named. Yeah, there were other bigger things because. I don't think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Was it dissent? The two justices
The dissenters.
minority, did they file a dissent?
Yes, they did say they were worried that this set a precedent for others seeking compensation under the Superfund law. And essentially, I don't think anybody is insisting the Supreme Court was wrong. Congress screwed up. They put in the Superfund law that state statutes of limitations are precluded by the Superfund law. So therefore, which is what they have in most states. North Carolina and only 3 other states have what they call statutes of repose. And because of the legal language, the Superfund law says statutes of limitations are out the window on environmental cases. They didn't address statutes of repose. And the court said, since the Congress didn't address it, we have no choice but to say the state law can't be superseded.
Any indication of any interest in any members of Congress?
I think there will be. I think in North Carolina, Senator Kay Hagan is in the midst of a really tough re-election battle. I think she could make this issue something. It would be hard for Republicans even to say these people should not have their day in court, that they should have the right to seek compensation. So I think she's planning to introduce a bill that probably will get some support and probably pass. The North Carolina legislature already just this week started making moves to change its statute of repose to a statute of limitations, which would probably solve the problem for the victims. But whether it can get through, and North Carolina's.
But even if it gets through, is it now going to apply retroactively back to 35 years?
That's a good question. That's the legal question that'll be fought about. So I think really the ultimate solution is if Congress makes it very clear, even if they specifically said Camp Lejeune victims should have the right to go to court, something like that. That would be hard for the government to argue against. But it was really kind of surprising to me. The Obama administration was behind the veterans from Camp Lejeune when they signed this bill when President Obama signed the bill in 2012 to give health care to under the Janie Act. But his administration took this stance, which is right in the face of the victims, and like I said, it's almost like a catch-22 because they're saying you can't file suit after more than 10 years have passed since the last act of pollution. But it was 12 years before the government acknowledged the water at Camp Lejeune was contaminated in 1997. So how can they possibly have known to file suit for damages. And how can you file suit for damages in 1994 for cancer that you don't have yet? You know, it's just it's to me it's very outrageous. But that's the stance they're taking because of the potential liabilities they have. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, being a city person, I was just wondering, do you know more typical depths of wells that would be drilled? You said it was 150 feet there, like in an area like this, or maybe in the mountains. What more typical depth of?
Well, I guess it
ground-
depends where the aquifer is.
Uh-huh.
At Camp Lejeune, I said 150 feet is that's kind of where the aquifer began,
Right.
but it went down to a depth of about 300 to 400 feet in some places.
Uh-huh.
So it's pretty large, and they usually tap into those wells wherever they can. You know, the shallower ones are the easiest ones to draw from, but boy, there are wells. I guess that some places that go many more distance than that. I don't know in the city. I don't think in the city you're getting your water from wells,
No, I
right?
just wanted the geology.
Yeah.
If you knew.
Yeah. Oh, it's different everywhere. And you know, there may be a well that's below contaminated landfills, but I mean, water tables below. But if the soil is clay and you know it's pretty solid, right? The EPA would know more. There isn't as much going into the water, if any. You know,
Right.
so it really depends on the geology.
Sandy soil.
Sandy soil is the worst. You know, everything that goes, it's just like filtered down into it. So, okay, I think that's about an hour or so. I appreciate your all coming and.